podcast. I'm Dan Brunskill, and on today's show we have the new Labour finance spokesperson, Barbara Edmonds. In a previous life, she was a specialist tax lawyer who provided advice to both National and Labour ministers during her career. Now she's a Labour MP in one of the top jobs. In this episode, we ask her what the coalition government is getting wrong when it comes to fiscal policy, what her party would do instead, and generally try to learn a little bit more about her political philosophy. Barbara Edmonds, thank you for coming on the podcast.
Talofa and kia ora, and thank you very much for having me.
How have you been settling into the new job?
Oh, it's been a baptism, that's for sure. It's been good. I mean, I look back, I think it's been maybe 5-6 weeks now. You know, lots has happened, and somebody recently said to me they feel like I'm just getting into my stride, and it kind of does feel like that, but every day's a different day, so you've got to approach it a little bit differently every day. But yeah, I'm settling in.
And presumably your first big test will be the government's first big test as well, in the budget.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, and most people probably don't behind the scenes, you know, in politics, a lot of planning goes into that, both in opposition and in government. So we will have a team supporting us, and we only get an hour before it's actually delivered in the House. So we have to go in there with a really clear strategic plan as to what we're going to be looking for, and to be able to form what will be the basis of our speeches, both in the House straight afterwards, and then as well as having a bit more time afterwards to kind of talk to the cuts, which we believe will be cuts post the budget.
So you almost have a team wargaming, saying this is what we expect to be in it, preparing different speeches you could possibly use?
Well, Dan, I'm a lawyer, so quite used to having what we'd call war rooms, basically, where you basically build the evidence base, you have a look at what statements have been made, and then you compare them to what happens on the actual day. So, it's a bit of a skill that lawyers have, but also it's a team thing. You know, you got to have a good team behind you and around you. So we're getting ready and getting our game plan ready for that one.
That's great. So opposing the government, probably the main part of what you are doing at the moment, because Labour just lost an election and has sort of wiped its policy slate clean. Between the day-to-day work of opposing things, how is that? Can you talk to us about that process of forming new policy? How does that work, and where are you at in that process?
So I see the finance role, or for me the priorities are threefold. As you said, hold the government to account, steward our party through the policy development process, and actually the third part is actually meeting a lot of different sectors, so businesses, NGOs, finance sector. Because we have an open book now when it comes to policy development, it's just basically listening to new ideas, meeting new people, and then for me it's basically being able to help our party and walk through what our manifesto will be like going into the next election. So the actual party process itself, just like most political parties, we will have a more local discussion about different remits, etc., and then we'll have an annual conference where those remits get filtered through and analysed and voted off the floor. So that's just our normal Labour Party constitution. But the actual role that I really need to play as part of that process is helping to inform our members, you know. So they might want to do X, but it's going to cost Y. So if it's going to cost Y, what are the trade-offs we need to make as a party in order to achieve X? Yeah.
A finance minister is often described as almost having veto power over the government. Is it true in opposition as well, or do you have to be more cooperative?
I'm a team player anyway. I'm a real person that right throughout my different careers, not just the time that I've been here in Parliament and in the Beehive, I've always leaned heavily on a collaborative approach. I find that's because you need people to champion it, not just yourself. So for me, it'll be definitely, if I need to say no, I'll say no. I'm a mum of 8. I know how to say no. But at the same time, it doesn't mean that I don't give other people the opportunity to be able to feed into that process. And we will negotiate and we will change things. But ultimately, if I believe that it's going to put Labour into a difficult fiscal position going into the next election, I will make those views very clearly known.
I'm a sibling of 8.
Oh,
and
awesome.
I'm very bad at saying no.
What number are you?
I'm number 7.
Oh, okay. So those babies, yeah, you're a bit more special. And I think about my number 7 and 8, and yeah, they get away with a lot more than number 1 does. Number 1's the ceiling breaker. So nice to know that, Dan.
Us youngest ones, we got spoilt relative to the oldest ones.
Well, that's what the oldest ones say, right?
Okay.
But I believe in some ways, when I reflect over my own children, sometimes you have to compensate number 1 and number 2 and 3 a bit more because of the difficult decisions they had to break the ceilings for. So, yeah. But that's right, we can talk about that offline.
Another time. Labour has a policy council with a couple of names that will be familiar to our readers, and Craig Rennie and Michael Wood. How does that policy council fit in, and if they advise something, do you have to do it?
So constitutionally, again, we have a policy council. We work together. I'm also a member of that policy council. I'm one of the MPs that is on it, because you have caucus reps, you have sector reps, and then you have those that have been elected into it. We work really collaboratively around the types of information, again, policy documents that maybe the rest of the party need to be aware of to help them formulate remits and discussions. We help provide support for structures around remits, and then as well as basically ultimately the policy council and the caucus work together with the leadership team across the party and those that are within the caucus to sign off the manifesto process. So it's a really old process that we've had, but it's one that really depends on the goodwill of everybody around the table.
Mm-hmm. And it sounds to me like we won't see a lot of that until quite close to even an election year. Is that, when would you expect to reveal parts of that?
Yeah, So Chris Hipkins, I keep saying Chippy, in his values speech did say, we're going to be talking about different policy platforms. I believe that we will need to come out publicly with what our different policy platforms will be a little bit longer than what we had when we were in government. And we have that ability to in opposition, is because you can basically start to test that with the electorate and you can have deeper conversations about it. So I won't give a specific time frame, but I will say it won't be like 6 weeks before the election. We need to do a lot of work in order to convince the public of New Zealand that the alternative that we are putting on the table is the alternative that will lead to them having a better life.
Is there any scenario in which that alternative does not include any tax reform?
No, tax reform is on the table, and Chippy has said that quite clearly in his values speech, and we've been quite open about it.
Would it be fair to say that it's a question of how you structure that tax reform, rather than if there's going to be some sort of capital wealth, land tax? It's just a question of what model you choose?
If I can step back a little bit, you need to ask what's the purpose of raising revenue? What's the purpose of tax? And you got to think, okay, we want to have, for Labour in our constitution, we want to have a fairer, more progressive, equitable society. So what does that look like? And also, on my hand as a finance minister, I know in 2060 we have some pretty massive challenges. 2060 looks like ages away. That is the next generation. That's my kids, the time that they go to retire. My kids are between the ages of 11 and 19. So we need to think, okay, what is the society that we want to leave this generation coming through? For yourself, for myself, for our older generation, for our younger generation, what is that society? And then how does tax help us to get to that? How does it help pay for that? So it is an element of the how we're going to basically afford the future society that we want to be able to create or to support, such as, for example, superannuation in 2060, 10% of GDP. Healthcare, 7% of GDP in 2060. That's a really big cost. And that's just based on the books as they are. So Treasury and IMF, they all have different views about what New Zealand needs to do for tax reform. For a Labour Party, it's what is the society we want to leave for this next generation, and how do we get there, and how does tax support that?
Mm-hmm. But even beyond revenue raising and the many fiscal challenges that are coming along, just from a fairness perspective, New Zealand does undertax capital.
Yeah, and that's what the IMF and Treasury believe as well. We're not the only ones that believe that in that respect. So yeah.
I was quite struck by their visit, actually, because they did say, yes, we keep saying this, and yes, it's still true, and we suspect at some point someone will listen to us.
Yeah, and I think, the IMF have the ability to be able to look across the world. For example, again, we don't have a capital gains tax here in New Zealand. They see that that's a very orthodox tax that is in place across almost every jurisdiction in the OECD. But again, for the Labour Party, we have to think about, okay, again, what is the goal we're trying to achieve here, and does whether the taxation of capital, because it doesn't have to just be through the form of a capital gains tax, how do we get there to achieve those goals?
Why is it so hard to sell to the electorate?
It's politics. It really is. But, politics is about people. And which is, again, I go back to that very key purpose for me, which is to be able to steward, that sort of conversation within our party and then grow it. So I've said that we need to be able to, when we come out with the policy, is basically really nurture it, really get around the country, help people to understand that, these are the challenges we are leaving our children. These are the challenges that we are leaving you as an older person or as a younger person that's going to be an older person, whether you have a family or not. So it's being able to convince the electorate. I mean, I have heard a previous Prime Minister story that someone told me that the previous Prime Minister says you don't win elections on tax. And in fairness, that's correct. But what you do win elections on is what you can commit to about a better health system, a better education system, making sure that those are more vulnerable, we can support them as a government, making sure our businesses who want to grow are supported to grow.
Okay. The coalition government wants to consolidate spending. I think it's too high. We've been running a structural deficit for quite a few years now. Are they getting it wrong, or is this the right thing to do?
I think there always needs to be a level of fiscal prudency when it comes, especially if you're a finance spokesperson or a finance minister. But what I don't believe is that the choices that they're making around tax cuts is the right way to invest in the economy. The right way to invest in the economy, which a number of economists are basically saying very strongly, is now is not the time for tax cuts, now is the time to invest in infrastructure. And that's, what is infrastructure? For your viewers, as they know, it's our schools, it's our health infrastructure system, it's our roading, it's what do we leave in respect to climate action, is it public transport infrastructure? So it's their view and as to how they want to basically provide what I would say is very close to an austerity. But for me, when Labour came into government in 2017, core Crown expenses to GDP was around 27%. But at the same time, you had sewage running down the walls of hospitals. You had schools that didn't have classrooms that were fit to learn in. We don't believe that 27% core Crown net expenses is a good measure. Is a good rate, or where it was at, and that's why when we came in, we did spend a bit more.
Grant Robinson said anything below 30% is austerity. Would you agree with that?
I'd agree with that. Yeah, I mean, and Treasury do say that there's they believe that given the size of our economy, they believe around 30% is a good place to be.
Okay. The coalition government doesn't seem likely to go below that. So do you think it's fair, therefore, to characterise it as austerity?
I just don't know how they're going to afford it,
right,
to be fair. And they, this is quite a political word, but they keep gaslighting the New Zealand economy, saying we've got a huge amount of debt, and yet our net debt to GDP was one of the lowest in the OECD. So my question is they've said they're not going to borrow to pay for tax cuts, but does that mean that they are going to borrow to pay for infrastructure spend? They basically, it's like an impossible triangle, or as what Grant would say, it's a Bermuda Triangle. So I believe in that respect that if it's not going to be austere and it's under 30%, then where is that investment going? Because we've already seen they're quite clear, they're okay with giving $2.9 billion to landlords, but yet lunches in schools is being reviewed. We have the disabilities sector who are really upset with the tightening of the restrictions. We also see that now with veterans around the tightening of the access to some of those funds that they can have to support them. So for us, it's all about choices and and we don't believe that the $2.9 billion to landlords is actually the best place to put it, or tax cuts.
So would it be fair to say that you support where they're trying to bring government spending down to, but not cutting services to fund tax cuts?
That was in our fiscal plan.
It's the balance.
We were to get to surplus in 27. So for us, it was basically we had a structured fiscal plan which basically looked, over the forecast period to bring debt down, to bring expenses down, and we started doing that with our program of work. Between 1% to 2% for public services. But we knew, based on the information that we got in 2023, the 1% to 2% meant that it wouldn't cut into the frontline services. We knew that that's where we could comfortably make savings within the public sector. So I believe that basically we had a prudent plan. We would have had to possibly revisit it, given that the budget policy statement and the books when they were opened up, they were a little bit worse, but that's adjustments that you make as a prudent finance person. And again, I don't believe that the National Party numbers ever added up during the election, and now they've got a whole bunch of promises, but it's not clear as to how they're going to pay for them.
Lots of economists came out around the pre-fu and said, yes, there's a path to surplus here, but it's tight, and then, as you say, the economy's worsened since then. Is there a part of you that is pleased you're not the one having to announce spending cuts, that someone else is doing that? Because if you had been in government, you would likely be, to stay on track to surplus, having to make deeper cuts than you had planned. Is there a part of you that's pleased someone else is doing the difficult job so that when you come in, the books are in better shape?
I'm never pleased we're in opposition. We should have been in government. But at the same time, again, their choice. If they can find the $2.9 billion for landlords, then they need to be able to find the 2.9 that could pay for a whole raft of other measures.
But if you had been re-elected, you would be comfortable cutting spending further than had been outlined in the pre-fiscal plan?
So I would describe myself as quite prudent and quite considered. That's just my style. That's just the way I have always been. And so if we had to make more cuts, or we had to actually look at different savings in order to ensure that lunches in schools kept going, to ensure that the public transport subsidies could keep going, to ensure that we could continue to invest in public transport routes, etc., we would have had to make those decisions. So I wouldn't apologise for making those types of choices, but what I wouldn't have done is promised really unaffordable tax cuts.
Would you deliver a surplus as Finance Minister?
Yeah, I mean, it's part of the goal, right? You want to be able to have that forecast period where you can say that you want to bring back down, and bring us back into surplus. So that'll be one of the goals, but not at the expense of not investing in infrastructure, not at the expense of kids being hungry at school. That's just all the types of trade-offs and the choices you have to make as a finance minister.
Okay. I guess the one thing I worry about is the surplus keeps getting pushed out, and now even Willis is saying it'll be beyond the election. So theoretically, it could be you that's responsible for delivering that in 2028. Would you keep that date?
For me, we need to look at the books. And again, that's a really important part of being a finance spokesperson. You need to look at what the information is to hand. So in budget 2023, it was really clear. We had line by line as to where all the different spending was going to go. You also have specific fiscal risks. There's a chapter in the budget that's for that, and then you had pre-fu. The books were all transparent and open, but they still didn't change their fiscal policy or their revenue policy to match what was clearly a well-signalled slowing down of the economy. So that's not the type of finance minister I ever would hope to be, which is basically when it's right in your face that either one, you don't know the detail, you haven't looked at it properly, and that you don't shift. I think it's important to be flexible as a Minister of Finance, and basically if it means that you get some things wrong, but it's for the betterment of our economy, then take it on your shoulders, because actually you're the person responsible for making sure we keep people in jobs. You're the person supporting businesses to make sure that things are easier for them, that you basically are able to help farmers with trading overseas, because that's our number one export is our primary sector, and then making sure that our kids are learning in good classrooms.
In the absence of a policy platform, let's get to know you a little bit.
Oh, yep.
And we can do this quite fast. We don't have that much time left. But what's a political leader you most admire?
I do have a real soft spot for Grant and Jacinda, but that's because I worked really closely with them. But actually, when you say that, the first name that comes to my mind is Michael Cullen. The reason being is that his legacy he left behind, which is the super fund, KiwiSaver, working for families, his choices in working for families, supported by Prime Minister Helen Clark, meant that my family basically got out of poverty. So, have a huge respect for Michael Cullen.
He's got a credible policy platform. And then the next question was economic policies you've admired, but you've just listed maybe 4 or 5.
Yes.
So we can skip right over it. Do you think politicians can still enact that kind of big change, or do we live in sort of a grand era of centrism where we don't have that much money to do anything and there's so many challenges that we're just trying to stay afloat?
You have to convince the electorate. Policy, and what I mean by that is politicians have to be connected to the ground. And so for me, I'm very grounded in the sense when I go back home in Porirua, when I look around where I live, I go past state houses. There's a couple of state houses that are my neighbours, Being able to have that in your face every day, or be able to see that either people are doing better or doing worse. If you're not connected to that and not connected to the different sectors of our economy, then you probably won't make decisions that are well-formed or ones that people like, and then they won't vote you in.
Okay. Most underrated achievement of the last Labour government?
It sounds weird, but I would say the winter energy payment. Mm-hmm. It has been a payment which I get a lot of correspondence on for people saying, thank goodness I've got this additional money to help me with energy costs, with electricity bills. For me, I think it's going to become, and because it's quite clear that it became a little bit heated during the campaign, it's a legacy policy. But you add that to the rest of the Labour legacy policies, working for families, KiwiSaver, winter energy payment. So I think for us it was something that we did very early in our term, and then just kind of came part of every of those that were applicable for it, just became part of the norm for them, that they knew during the winter time they get this little extra boost to help them. So I think it almost became like it was just kind of normal. But I think it was kind of more underrated than them probably, because we did it so early in our term.
It feels so normal now that people don't talk about it.
Yeah, totally. That's a good point.
And then a hard question to finish on. What's one good thing the coalition government is doing?
Okay, actually, the work that Shane Jones is doing around regional economic development, so his fund. I got to see very closely in 2017 to 20, when I worked as a staffer in the Beehive, what those projects meant to the regions. He clearly negotiated a part of this new government. I believe that it's investment that our regions do need to have. And so, I saw surf clubs that had been developed out of it. I saw mussel farms out in the East Coast. These are the actual things that will help economic development in those regions. So I think that is one good thing that this government, they've kept it as part of the coalition agreement. So congratulate Shane Jones on that one.
Cool. Barbara Edmonds, thank you so much for coming on and talking to us.
Awesome. Thanks,
Hope to have you on again.